My name is Molly Wills, and I'm the Director of Grassroots Organizing at Rural Vermont and a member of the People's Agroecology School Collective. And we are so honored to be hosting the second annual short course in People's Agroecology. And we have about 40 farmers, farm workers, and food justice activists from across Vermont, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Nicaragua, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere. And it is such an honor to be sharing this space with you all and to also have the input and contributions from some truly incredible local farmers. So we're very appreciative that you all joined us. And we're gonna start pretty big. Rural Vermont turns 40 this year, and exactly, yay! And it's 4 decades. So Rural Vermont is we are a grassroots member-led organization. And so everything that we work on comes from the community of farmers and farm workers and issues that are impacting them that they identify need change. So it comes from the bottom up always. And we have had the honor of being so leaderful over these last 40 years and following the guidance and strategy of truly incredible people from across Vermont. So indulge me for a moment as I take you on a pretty quick history lesson, and it's gonna just be showing you some photos of what this looks like over the years, and then we're gonna actually see and hear what it looks like in real time and hear about a couple farmers' experiences, what it looks like on the ground. And then we're going to zoom in even further, and we're going to talk about the food system in the Northeast Kingdom and some of the incredible organizers, activists, and systems that folks have set up to increase their food sovereignty, to increase their community resiliency, and increase the control that we have over our food and farming system. Interpreters, am I speaking too quickly? No, thank you, Jill. All right. You can read the Rural Vermont mission. I'm going to read this to you because this is one of my favorite quotes, and I think it really epitomizes a lot of the work that we do. If you give me a fish, you have fed me for a day. If you teach me to fish, then you have fed me until the river is contaminated or the shoreline is seized for development. But if you teach me to organize, then whatever the challenge, I can join together with my peers, and we will fashion our own solution. So we're here today to talk about organizing. We're here to talk about movement building. And we're here to talk about increasing community control and food sovereignty and resiliency for our communities and the generations that will come beyond. So Rural Vermont was founded in 1985 in direct response to a farm crisis that was experienced by many across Vermont and also across the country. We were founded on principles of direct action because the government was not helping farms, and there was a conglomeration of crises having to do with land, parity pricing, international trade agreements, and I think of it as a pincushion, the many, many, many small cuts that make farming for community scale farmers incredibly difficult. This is Anthony Polina working with a farmer back in 1986. These are just some news clippings to give you a sense of what rural Vermont is about. And you can see some of these early themes that we were organizing around are still incredibly relevant today. So this says too many imports, low exports, high national debt, Reagan, too few farmers, lack of political power. Do any of these feel not, the Reagan piece has maybe morphed a little bit, but pretty much everything feels quite relevant to the current day and age. So in rural Vermont's early days, what it really looked like was farmers taking to the streets to raise awareness about the crisis that they were experiencing. So there was a number of milk dumps. There were blockades in the streets. There were a lot of protests and street theater and art to bring awareness to the crisis that our community farms are experiencing. And you can see these incredible historical leaders and activists taking time they don't have away from the farm in order to build something to benefit the greater good, which is, you all know, we're in a room full of many farmers, and it's the most difficult thing to do, to leave the farm and to spend time and energy on a long game like this. So some of the issues that we've worked on over the years include anti-GMO work, especially related to the growth hormones. Current Use is a program that Vermont has that essentially has our state looking, it's the reason our state looks the way that it does, and that so many farms are still prevalent, because it allows land to be taxed on the agricultural value rather than the development value. Which so many farms would be priced out if that wasn't the case. But you see these folks showing up in the streets, they're raising awareness, they're shutting down the streets in Montpelier oftentimes. This is a farmer, Lee Light, who left this plain about a year ago, farmer in Marshfield for many years, protesting the general agreement on tariffs and trades. So this work is super local, right? Like, these are issues that impact Vermont farmers, but there's a recognition that the policies we have here don't just impact the farms that we have here. They have a ripple effect, and they impact communities all across the world. And the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades was detrimental for farms both in Vermont and across the globe. This is some street theater led by some Northeast Kingdom folks, Justin Lander and Rose Friedman, and this is demonstrating the death of the family farm in 1985, and corporate power is the Grim Reaper. There's a theme here. This is a street protest about GMOs. A lot of what we do ends up in a regulatory space. So we're working, there's two prongs. We're working on immediate harm reduction to try to support farmers with what they need right now. So what are the rules and the regulations that we can change to literally keep folks in business tomorrow, the next day, next year, in 20 years? And then what's the systemic transformational change that we all know that we need in order to truly support our agrarian communities, and by extension, all of us? And so we're constantly doing both of those things. This graphic is related to a farm who wanted to sell chicken that was raised across the street at their restaurant, and they weren't allowed to do so. And so this was an act of civil disobedience that was planned, and it ended up in a change of regulations, and we were successful in that one, and it has since expanded quite significantly, which we will hear more about from Hannah. Folks just want to grow food, right? We want to farm, we want to take care of the land, each other, our families. It shouldn't be too much to ask. And what we're talking about is building our sovereignty and building the power in our communities and how we regulate the farm community. This is a raw milk producer in Randolph. And so we organize, but we also educate. So if one of the pillars of our pyramid is bringing people together and unifying and finding out where we have common cause and agreement, the other piece is providing education. And a lot of that is farmer to farmer. It is sharing traditional skills that are not easily accessed elsewhere, at least at an affordable rate. So this is an on-farm slaughter workshop. I'm not sure where this one happened, but we do them all over the state with Mary Lake, who is an incredible itinerant slaughterer. And something simple like the act of being able to slaughter your own animals on your farm, it seems like a small thing, and it's a traditional, it's a tradition, right? It's something that people have been doing for millennia until the government says that's not safe. You can't do that anymore. You need to follow like XYZ food safety standards, which are of course incredibly important. And also we know that there's ways to do things at a community scale that can really feed us and keep all of us well and nourished. One of the things that we do is we bring farmers into spaces where there are decision makers and policy makers, because a lot of this is about education, right? It's about helping the folks who have power and have decision-making capacity understand the realities for the agricultural community and understand what's going on for them. So we packed I think this is the House Ag Committee. This is a room full of farmers talking to the folks in suits about what's going on for them and what the realities are on their farm. And you can see people's eyes widen, like there's just such a disconnect sometimes between folks that work the land and those that are maybe more removed from that history. The flip side of it is bringing those with power, political power, decision-making power to farms. So this is an event where we brought politicians to the New Farms for New Americans farm in Winooski to hear about what was going on for folks. And what I love about this is that one of the most important things that came out of that meeting was we learned that this farm wasn't on the bus route, and a lot of these folks didn't have access to personal transportation. And so they would be making rafts and filling their rafts with their produce, because they're subsistence farmers. They're growing all the food they need for the year, and they were floating it across the river because this farm wasn't on the bus route. And then there's a politician from Burlington who comes to this event who has the power to make that change. And once people know about what's happening for people, we can make changes for the greater good. And sometimes it's small things, sometimes it's not. And it's not always so fast. Tom Gilbert cameo here. This is another example of politicians being brought to farms. This is at, oh, sorry, you guys, I think I've been there the whole time. This is, I believe, at Vermont Compost Company, but correct me if I'm wrong, Tom. And again, it's like we're meeting people where they're at. We're sharing our lived experiences and stories with folks who have the ability to make change. Part of this work is solidarity. It's recognizing that Vermont has probably over 1,500 undocumented migrant farm workers that are completely supporting our dairy industry and are an incredibly fundamental part of our community food system. And so in this instance, we follow the guidance and the leadership of groups like Migrant Justice, who are working on migrant farm worker solidarity. And we show up in the streets, and we recognize and amplify the needs of this community and the importance that they have in our food system. A lot of what we do is listen. We bring people together, and we have conversations, and we hear what's going on for people, and we strategize, and we listen to what are the community ideas that you have for, like, what are the gaps that are currently in your community? What can we change moving forward? And those of you who are familiar with Vermont it'll resonate when I say that, like, neighborhood to neighborhood, it's incredibly different, right? Like, every little nook of this state, it might look the same sometimes, but different communities are experiencing really different things and have different systems of support. So the idea is that the folks who are most impacted are the ones who are involved in the decision making and help lead us to the future that we need. And we just like to bring in art. So this is that same organizing meeting you can see this one was in Craftsbury. We're talking about public banking. We're talking about farmer education, having a local farmer union, supporting more agricultural education, having better community land trusts. Like, these are all issues that are still incredibly relevant and are desired by communities. And we're lucky enough to have really inspiring stories of success, both in Vermont and beyond, to help us develop some of these. All right, so enter the People's Agroecology School of Vermont. So rural Vermont has been a member of a social movement called La Via Campesina for, where are we at? Probably 30 some odd years now. They were founded in the early 90s. We participate in this global platform through our work with the National Family Farm Coalition. And we've taken incredible inspiration and leadership from the global community of agrarians who have shown us that using agroecology schools as a tool for building a social movement, building literacy amongst farmers, increasing our political education so we can share more unity and common cause in the work that we're doing. And these schools have been incredibly successful and valuable to rural communities across the world. And so in 2022, again, we had the incredible honor and privilege to host a number of leaders and mentors from Vermont and from this global community to support us in exploring what this idea could look like in Vermont. Because it's kind of a new thing. Agroecology isn't a word that we say very often or hear very often, and yet it's something that many, many farms in Vermont are practicing every single day. So you can kind of see how this movement works. And so rural Vermont's decisions are made at the uber local level, right? It's like what's impacting people's communities, their farms. We interact with national policy through the National Family Farm Coalition, and then we get into regional spaces with North America through La Via Campesina North America, and then we link into this global movement, which is active in many, many countries around the world. And it's funny because a lot of you are leaders in this movement, and it feels odd to be explaining this to you. But in the nature of shared understanding, thank you for bearing with me. So in 2022, we had the Each One Teach One Agroecology encounter, where we sort of floated this idea of what could an agroecology school look like in Vermont? What would it have to look like in order for it to be used by and useful to the community of agrarians that are here and have been doing this work for generations, standing on the shoulders of many, going all the way back to indigenous peoples in this place and beyond. And what we learned was that people are thirsty for this idea. And also, they want us to support the people who are already doing it. So we don't need to build something new and shiny. And so when we talk about a school, we're talking about a school without walls. We're talking about a school that exists at every single farm, because farmers, not all of them want to be educators, but inherently they have an incredible amount of experience and knowledge to share. And when you put a bunch of farmers in a room together, magic happens, and people learn and they grow, and we become more unified as a community, and we can also increase this shared commonality and our shared understanding of how we might be able to build a more sustainable future together. So what does this actually look like? We know these people, some of them are in this room. Farmer exchange, right? We're literally just creating spaces for farmers to be together, to learn from each other. They might not speak the same language, and yet there is this inherent understanding from people who work the land, and connection and vitality that is shared. And then we also send delegations of folks to other places. And so this is a delegation of Vermont farmers in Cuba, hosted by Margarita of the Caribbean Agroecology Institute. And why Cuba? Because they've been leading in agroecology by necessity for the last 30 years, more or less. And we have so much to learn from a population of people whose access to resources is incredibly limited by US policy. So it gets us back to that political space, right? The embargo, the blockade that is making life incredibly difficult for the people of Cuba, that's on us. I mean, we are not our government, but it's important that we understand how the policies that we put in place impact people around the world. This is just more examples. So political education is the second tier. If farmer exchange is the first, political education is the second. And that's I think of it as peeling back the onion, right? Because when you think about it, our problems and the issues that we face may be really different, especially depending on the countries that we live in and farm in and the territories that we inhabit. But often when you peel back that onion, the underlying causes that we're working against are the same. And often it is corporate domination of our food system. It's lack of community control. It is lack of power and political power and division, making us all feel isolated. So we have farmer exchanges, we have political education, and we have shared work, because we believe so strongly that when we live together, when we learn together, when we work together, that's how we build our commonality, and that is how we understand, we increase our understanding where each other's coming from. We can start to see the human across our differences, and again, build this future that will benefit the greater good. This is just more examples of us working together. I would like to take a moment to honor the legendary Bruce Kaufman in the upper left-hand corner. We can take a moment. Bruce has been a leader in the farming community, a leader in the farm cooperative movement, and an incredible community member for 50 years in Vermont, more or less. And one of the founding members of the Agroecology School. And our hearts go out to Bruce and the many gifts that he has shared with us. So, what does this actually look like, right? We're talking, it's a little bit of rhetoric, we're talking movement building, we're talking political power and building our food sovereignty, but what does that actually look like on the ground? How does that actually impact folks who are farming every day and just want to farm tomorrow and for the next 5 years, 10 years, generations to come? Folks just want access to the land and to be able to grow food for their community. So I have the incredible honor of passing the mic to Hannah Pierce of Hillside Farm. you said East Albany? I always get the Albanys mixed up. I apologize. But a truly incredible farm, amazing father-daughter operation who has been providing the community with the most amazing chicken and more. Sausages, what else you got right now? Mostly chicken, yeah. Turkey, it's really... Oh, I haven't seen those. That is great. And also, so in addition to how Hannah and her farm feed the community, she's also building community in a really powerful way. Oy. And one of the ways that's done is by bringing people together and by being an accessible member of the community, which I think you've done in so many ways. And I'm going to stop talking about you and just let you talk about yourself. And thank you so much, Hannah, for being here.
Hi, my name is Hannah Pierce. I own Hillside Farm, or Pierce's Pastured Poultry. And we're a pastured poultry operation about 20 minutes from here in Albany. And we raise mostly broiler chickens, turkeys, some pigs. We raise about 4,300 chickens on pasture, about 300 turkeys a year, and just a handful of pigs. We also process all of our poultry on farm, which kind of is kind of the main way I have interacted with policy and rural Vermont. So we, instead of shipping our birds off farm to a USDA inspected facility, we're able to process them all, cut them all up, package them, and we sell pretty much entirely direct to consumer. So I've been farming for 9 years, and my dad, Bill, started our operation about 4 or 5 years before that. I kind of accidentally stumbled back onto the farm when he needed some extra help after I moved back from being gone a long time, and quickly realized that's where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And now, 9 years in, I'm the main manager of the farm. So we process on farm, which means we work under the poultry exemption from inspection, which is a state program that allows us to sell uninspected poultry that we process. Policies have changed twice in my time farming that have dramatically affected our operation, luckily in the positive direction. When I started farming 9 years ago, we were limited to raising and processing 1,000 birds. And as you can imagine, that's not like a substantial enough harvest annually to support a household whatsoever. And so we approached our local rep, who happened to be the Senate Ag Committee chair, which was probably lucky for us. And rural Vermont got very involved, and through testifying at the state level, we worked on expanding that exemption law to a 5,000 bird limit, and then also a 20,000 bird limit. This allowed me to really invest in the future of my farm, because there was no way I could make it a living. It's hard enough with 1,000 birds. So we pretty much jumped right in, and now we're raising close to that limit. Then last year, we were able to convince the state lawmakers to further update that law to allow us to cut up our own birds. Before that, we could only sell whole birds, and along with all the other constraints of being an on-farm processor, which are you can only sell direct to end user, which means you sell it from the farm, sell it at farmers markets, or to restaurants. But they also have to jump through some hoops in order to serve our meat. So they have to have specific menu labeling. We essentially have to register to the state that tells them that they're selling meat from our farm. So we can't sell across state lines. We can't use a distributor. We can't sell in stores. So there's a lot of limitations. It also meant we couldn't cut up our bird and sell a chicken breast or a chicken thigh. That really limits the amount we make per bird. And one of a really important principle for me in farming is that my community members can actually afford the food that I raise. So it really limits our options and limits our growth by not being able to cut up birds. So last year, we went back to the state, and again, rural Vermont was very involved in that and in organizing many farmers across the state that this was affecting, along with butchers and other people who are kind of in the industry that this restriction affected. And we, again, testified, some people multiple times, about how big of a difference this would make to our businesses. Luckily, unlike, 7 years ago when they increased the maximum birds you could do, the meat inspection office was much more game to support this law change. So we were able to get them to change the law by crossing out one word. Pretty much they crossed out whole, and which allows us to cut up our own birds. And just to give you an idea of how much this affected us, I wrote this down. So in 2023, and for a few years before that, I was shipping a few hundred birds to a USDA plant across the state. It took about 2 hours to get there. And I would have some birds cut up, so I was able to bring cuts to market because people expect it and you want to be able to provide it. But that costs a lot and was logistically a nightmare. So in 2023, we sent about 425 birds to be cut up. In 2024, essentially immediately after they changed the law, we cut up 725 birds, so almost doubling. And this year, so far this season, we've cut up about 550, and I plan to cut up around 900. And what that meant in terms of profit from those birds, we went from not even $4,000 in cuts to now, so far this season, almost $14,000 in cuts. And the first half of the year is the slower part. So it's expanding the profit we're making per bird exponentially, which about almost doubling the potential profit of each individual bird. And it's costing us about $5 less than it was to ship them across the state, and logistically way simpler. I'm also able to respond to customer wants, adjust week to week. We process every week, and so the cuts we're getting, I bring cuts that were harvested that week to market every single week, which is pretty awesome. And if someone wants a particular cut or a bulk pack of something, I can do that. And it's really, I mean, last year I think it kind of saved us too. I lost about 700 birds in shipping last year, which means chicks arriving dead, and which is for operation doing around 4,000 birds is pretty significant. And that's because of the changes to the USPS that slows down shipping, along with hotter weather, which is only getting hotter. And those changes meant that I couldn't really run my business, not knowing whether these animals were just going to die before they even got to the farm, which is obviously awful. Luckily, other farms are experiencing the same thing, or luckily, they're able to respond to that. So we partnered with other farms in Vermont, and they are now shipping, they're trucking birds up for 4 different farms in northern Vermont directly from the hatchery. So last year, when I was 500 birds short than my planned numbers, I luckily have a very understanding wholesale customer in Parker Pie in Glover, and they pretty much were shorted their winter supply of chicken, and I could cut up all those birds and make double the profit than I would have otherwise per bird, which offset the loss that we experienced. So my end of the year numbers were not as drastically down as they would have been otherwise. And that was in the first year of this operation. So I'm kind of seeing what we can do, what we can sell, because we still have all the limitations of the law about how we can sell it. But yeah, it really, it's been a total game changer, and I think even more so for smaller farms. We're in a weird middle ground. If you look at the poultry industry, we're like a nothing. But if you look at the poultry industry, let alone the pastured poultry industry in Vermont, we're pretty substantial comparatively. There's maybe one for sure, maybe a couple more operations that do the numbers that we do. So we're in this kind of weird pocket of scale that can have impact on our community, but not a lot of, nothing's really built for our size. So we've had to like customize pretty much every single piece of our operation, from like the coops that we have the birds in on pasture to how we process them. So this has given a lot more flexibility. So for a smaller farm, if you take a farm that has doing 1,000 birds, and they can cut up half of those and double that profit they're making, that's like a really significant change for them, and makes it so they're otherwise probably not very profitable operation, maybe at least paying for itself, which is something. So yeah, that's the policy changes have been really significant. I definitely wouldn't be farming if the maximum number hadn't been changed 7, 8 years ago. And then now that I'm 1 year into being able to cut, and I'm in the second year, and I kind of feel like I wouldn't have lasted much longer without that being an option. Yeah, so that's the deal. Anything else?
Thank you, Hannah. That was amazing. And it just goes to show that maybe our underlying current is we're building a movement, we're building shared commonality and cause amongst each other, but we're also taking steps to make the changes that folks need today and tomorrow to stay in business, because we all need to eat, and we need scale-appropriate regulations, which looks like food sovereignty. And the way that we see that path is through agroecology, which is really just a way of farming and a way of treating ourselves, each other, and the earth with dignity and respect. I'm going to pass it off to Graham, and Graham, maybe we should switch seats, and then we will hear from Tom. We're going to continue narrowing it in.
Thanks, Molly and Hannah. Nice to see you, Tom. Great to see you all. Thanks all for coming out. So my name is Graham Unangst-Ruffenacht. I am the policy director at Rural Vermont. So along with Molly, I actually work at Rural Vermont now. And what I'm going to talk to you a little about tonight is sort of how I got involved with this organization and what some of that work has looked like related to agroecology and food sovereignty. So in 2012, I was working at a school and community farm, Maple Hill School, some of you might know in Plainfield. And I'd gotten long enough in my work there, and they'd stopped having a herd of their own, where I started raising some of my own animals on their farm. It was the first time I'd been able to raise some of my own animals on a piece of land. I didn't have land to bring animals onto. We talk about scale-appropriate regulations. I think one of the reasons they're so important is because they give you an access point. You need to be able to step into a space without the costs of stepping into that space being so overwhelming that you can't possibly jump to a scale feasible enough to accomplish that. So I was working on this school farm, and they were letting me start to raise a few animals there. And I had those animals slaughtered on farm by itinerant slaughters. I had them brought to a local food hub and butcher I knew. And the Agency of Ag meat inspectors happened to go through that facility, saw that those carcasses did not have inspected labels on them, and put them in retainer, which meant that those carcasses couldn't go any further in the process. They were essentially hanging in a refrigerated facility, couldn't go further, and that means that not too long until they spoil. And Rural Vermont stepped in to support me through this process with the state. And it was a really intimidating process. I was 29, I think. I was brought into these big halls in the state ag building where I was a person with a number of state employees surrounding me, it felt like. And Andrea Stander, thankfully, the executive director of Rural Vermont at the time, beside me, sort of helping me navigate this experience I was going through. Rural Vermont helped me find pro bono legal representation to support through that work. And I would say, like, beyond Rural Vermont too, and this is part of why we're all here, is like the community also, helped me in that moment. We held a fundraiser in Plainfield, and we fundraised ultimately 3 times the amount that I was fined, for this. And thankfully, we also have an agency that did allow that meat to go out and at least go to people with a small fine and not have that meat destroyed. So shortly thereafter, I became more involved with Rural Vermont. I joined the board, I believe later that year. The next year, Rural Vermont had already been working on this issue of on-farm slaughter and sort of how do people access slaughter and processing in a world which is, if you wanted to bring an animal to slaughter next week at a USDA-inspected facility, they tell you should have called us last February. Or maybe before that. Actually, a couple of years ago, I was called in the September of the year before the September, and I'm seeing some people nod here. Remember that, too, during the pandemic. So you really need to have some sort of accessible way to do this, to get into it, to grow your understanding and to grow your ability to do this. So I stepped onto the board and worked there for a number of years and sort of saw some of these issues like Hannah spoke to, and sort of just the way this organization worked. And I ultimately transitioned to staff, where I am now, in 2017. And at that time, we sort of started undertaking this horizontal leadership transition. And I feel like that's really worth taking a second to touch on, because I think it really talks about what are the values we talk about in agroecology and food sovereignty, and this notion of parity within organizational structures and co-creation that creates. I think it's really been important for Rural Vermont, and as an organization that's now celebrating 40 years, as someone who's been there for more than 10 years of that and seen, almost 8 years now of horizontal leadership, it's just really striking to feel the difference and experience a different type of success and ability to be flexible in our work, to take on multiple projects, to explore different people's talents and affinities, more specifically. And as Molly said, we do policy, education, and organizing in support of and with communities. Molly showed a picture earlier of a big meeting with a lot of people. And part of what, after being on the board for a bit, when I came onto staff, I had this feeling of we need to go back to the well of the people, like we are, an organization that's constantly being fed by that. But what does it look like to get out? And we had this tour called the Groundswell Tour, where we visited 6 regions around the state and had some of those meetings where we asked those questions, like where we pushed through beyond what is traditionally understood as agriculture, like asking people, like, what are the unmet needs on your farm or in your community or in your household? Like, what are the barriers to those needs being met? And what are opportunities for overcoming those barriers and meeting those needs? And lastly, is there a role for rural Vermont to play in that? Or how do you see our organization doing that, help supporting this effort? And I think one of the things that I really took from that and our organization took from that that connects back to this agroecological work as well in this framing is that when it comes down to it, farmers, farm workers, agricultural communities, we're all human beings on this earth, and our most basic needs are our essential human rights. Our most basic needs are health care, their child care, there's transportation, it's education, it's access to affordable land and housing. And when we went from to community around Vermont, and you saw those graphic illustrations of the notes, that's what that was when Molly showed one of those art pieces. We had a graphic illustrator taking notes like that. Almost every page or poster or mural from every event showed those very similar themes. And I think the reality is a lot of the work being done around agriculture doesn't think about agricultural needs in that frame, so these issues get siloed off and sectioned off. So part of our work became, really trying to presence that work. Basic issues of accessibility, of affordability, and there's also an opportunity in recognizing those needs for the agricultural community, because it offers an opportunity to grow solidarity with other communities who are directly impacted by those issues or disproportionately impacted by those issues, but who may not be a rural farmer just like yourself. You may not be fitting into like the specific identity you think of yourself as all the time. And likewise, when you start going to those other tables and saying, I recognize I need to be sitting at the healthcare table too, your specific issues, as that positionality you have as a farmer, as a farm worker, as someone in an agrarian community, become a part of that conversation as well. And that's a really important part, because when we started sitting at some of those tables, we start seeing that, there's some other voices here from these rural communities or from these farming communities which just aren't present. And we start talking to researchers about how farming communities, for example, are affected by mental health, healthcare, childcare. In particular, you see that they're disproportionately affected, and affected in particular ways that aren't always taken into account. So that's a really important part, is like bringing that narrative there. And like Molly said, this sort of identifying our common ground beyond the local space, like she talked about the GATT, the free trade agreement. We talked about the joining of NFFC and La Via and the Nyaleni conference in the 90s. Part of this work, I think, in the last 7 or 8 years, as we become more understanding of, there's this community called Agroecology out here, is re-engaging with that community in this time and space. Before, when we're talking about the early 90s and the 80s, we're talking about a lot of dairy farm communities being the predominant farming communities still here in Vermont. And now you look at the census and the land base, absolutely, it's mostly dairy. But when the numbers of actual farms, you're talking about, I don't know, are we well below 500 dairy farms now? I don't have the exact numbers on me, but you're talking about 6,000 to 7,000 small diversified farmers. So you're talking about a really different context as well in some ways right now. We began to talk about and in presence, as I was saying, these issues more and more in the food community, began facilitating and pushing these grassroots peer-to-peer, farmer-to-farmer educational workshops, like blending the citizen advocacy, the grassroots organizing, the policy development on farm skills. And at the time, I feel like we didn't really know what to call our work. There's a lot of conversations at this time, and if people were around the Vermont scene for a bit, you might be like, oh, what's organic, is regenerative, there's conventional, there's all these things being talked about. And I think at rural Vermont, we didn't feel like, what's our home? We're not like we're not tied to any of these things. We want to support all these different values, and et cetera, et cetera. And I went to a panel at UVM, facilitated by the UVM Farmer Training Program in 2018. I actually just found it on YouTube yesterday when I was thinking about this. Sarah DeSantis, if you folks know, Sarah was running the program at the time. And like different categories of agriculture were being represented, and folks were just trying to distinguish and talk. And I heard Ernesto Mendez, who many of you probably know well, talking about agroecology and food sovereignty. And I thought, that is what we are doing at Rural Vermont. Like, this describes our work. This describes our values. And I think that was an important moment for me, and at some point, the organization as well, we all talked about this, et cetera, and became more in this community, not just because it added clarity, but because it connected us to this whole community of people locally and globally who have been doing this work in their own places for so long. And we're not alone. When you're sort of pushing the political edge and pushing into spaces that are uncomfortable, sometimes that can make you feel alone. But when you start to realize there's a whole community that's valuing these things and hitting these intersections as well and pushing these buttons, you feel more in a community, and you can make more change, and you can bring the voices locally to international spaces and vice versa and understand that global community more. So it's been a number of years since a lot of these initial shifts. I've seen in my time at Rural Vermont, we've really grown this coalition work that was talked about as well, and like just the idea of working with other organizations a lot, from the Farm to Plate Network, which is more of like a traditional one, and working in working groups there, to more specific coalitions that need to be found in response to things that emerge. We talked about the poultry farmers here. We had another poultry farmers group, which Tom was an integral part of, the Poultry Farmers for Compost Foraging, very specific. Pesticides coalitions, we're members in like other coalitions where it's just important to have our voice, like the Vermont Coalition for Palestinian Liberation right now, and other work, the Human Rights Council, which is a space where we stepped into in 2017. That was a longstanding organization that worked for healthcare as a human right, but became a place, was almost a congress of like justice-based organizations. So as I was reflecting on agroecology in rural Vermont and my time there, these are some of the things I thought of. And it makes me really excited because now there's this agroecology school starting. Thanks so many of you for putting your time, your lives, your love into this. I see so many faces here now in our community from all over the world and from our towns who I've known for a long time. Yeah, I'm not sure I have much more to say. That's part of my work here.
Thank you very much, Graham. And now we're going to transition to our last speaker of the evening before we open it up to some time for question and answer. And I hardly think Tom Gilbert of Black Dirt Farm needs an introduction, but this is Tom Gilbert of Black Dirt Farm, incredible community farmer and longstanding activist and incredible human. And I will pass it off to you. Thank you, Tom. Can we maybe move? How are we doing? Should we shift you over there? I don't know. It's 10 to 8. What time do you want to? Oh, we can go to 9:30 or 9.
I'll do that in 1 sec. Yeah, okay. So we're going to do, I can't sit, my body just can't do it, so I got to stand. I give you a little of my work with rural Vermont, and then I'm going to transition to the local food system organizing that we do in this area. And my hope for a lot of you that are coming into town is that tonight kind of helps you contextualize the rest of your time here. So hopefully you'll feel like you start to feel familiar with some of the things that when you show up, then you're like, oh, I see where this fits in. So that's kind of what we're aiming for, among other things. So I've been a rural Vermont member since 2001. So going on about 24 years, that's kind of a shocking thing to say out loud. And the first campaign that I started working on with rural Vermont was around GMOs. And at the time, we were really focused on manufacturer liability. So for those of you that were around at that time, you might remember all the contamination that was happening, and farmers like Percy Schmeiser from Saskatchewan. Shout out to Saskatchewan. People like Percy were fighting Monsanto toe-to-toe, and so through rural Vermont, we were supporting Percy, and we had Percy come to Vermont and tour the state town to town. We really had a massive grassroots campaign. I mean, there were hundreds of people. We were turning out in the streets regularly. And it was everything from like very, straightforward, just lobbying work to, protests and banner drops and a much higher level of adrenaline and excitement. And it was a multi-year campaign that was just incredibly well organized. I was really personally coming from the West Coast and having been involved in a lot of organizing there. I'm really thrilled having coming back to Vermont to find myself among great organizers and working on meaningful campaigns. We did not actually, we got that through the legislature after a couple years, and it died on the governor's desk when the corporate national farm lobbies really started pressing on Vermont. Because one thing for those of you that aren't from Vermont, hey John, that might not realize is Vermont is a very, very small state. We are like the smallest state. I think we're the second smallest state in terms of population, and we're one of the smallest states in terms of geography. And so we're not like a place like California here that when it passes a law, it kind of changes the national policies by itself. But Vermont has so much capacity to lean forward in ways that a state like California can't. And so we test the envelope. We were one of the first states, if not the first state, to require labeling of RBGH in milk. And so it starts to set a precedent nationally. So we're kind of the opposite of California. We're not going to set the national policy because we're too small, but we're going to sort of set the tone. And the other bookend that I'll provide to my work in rural Vermont, or my time with rural Vermont and the work of rural Vermont, has been this really sort of very specific work that Graham mentioned. I'm like so impressed that he even remembered the name of our working group. But it was this small group of poultry farmers that were practicing the practice that many of you saw today with the compost foraging, which we were starting to be told was not legal anymore, and we were getting pushed out. The origin of a lot of that work actually goes back to probably 2006, when after the GMO campaign, rural Vermont decided to do a little self-reflection, and we worked on this statewide tour to really reassess mission and theory of change and approach. And we rewrote the mission statement for the organization, but with hundreds of people involved. We were really highly organized, I think, into 6 regions in the state, and had committees, and a lot of people turned out. And it was a place where really the soil health got firmly put into the language of rural Vermont. And one of the things that I really feel dearly about rural Vermont is, with all of the great agricultural organizing I see happening in the US and beyond, I don't often see a lot of really hardcore advocacy for soil. It's the premise of everything we do, but it seems esoteric when we come to policy. But it got written in, and then when it started coming up that there was a lot of pressure to, at the very least, not be supportive of composting, small farm composting operations, and these poultry operations that were integrating composting. We got organized again, and so we've been in the trenches on this for the last 6 to 8 years. And rural Vermont has treated composting and soil health as if it was a crop. It's part of the culture, and it's not a stretch when we have a problem in those realms that people often sort of think of as solid waste, for rural Vermont to be very quick to pick up the torch and lean in. So as a producer, having rural Vermont staff who can be the glue of the efforts and hold the work together between meetings and advance the policy side of it, and be telling people when to show up and whatnot. We really need the organizers as much as we need the producers. So this is this is a key marriage of qualities. And I will say that with rural Vermont's help and the farmers that organized, we were successful in fighting back the last incursion on our work. So I think I mentioned today this effort for out-of-state methane corporations to start coming into Vermont and using depackaging technology to separate food from its packaging. It results in a lot of microplastics and other adulteration of those food scraps. So we've successfully fought that back, and on a policy front, this is like anybody who's like seriously interested in trying to close the loop on that food system and focus on discarded organic materials. It's a pretty key piece because it's kind of sweeping like a wildfire through the country right now. Okay, that's enough of that. I can't sit right now. No, I'm going to pull this so everybody can see it a little better, I think. How do I advance your slides? Just is it right in line? Okay. This seemed really big when I made it earlier, but I'm sure none of you can actually read it right now. That's okay. I got that. Okay, so really quickly, I didn't have time to put a presentation together, but I just wanted to give you a really quick piece because a lot of the work that you're going to see is right in this area. So, oh, my graphic didn't work. Damn. I know it was like really, really like very preschool, but it still was mine. Okay, today we were up here, and right now you're there. So there's about 7 towns right around here. This region of Vermont is called the Northeast Kingdom. And this little area right here, the 7 towns surrounding the town of Hardwick, is an area that we've sort of like informally designated as the Hardwick Area Food System. And it just gave us a geographical reference for starting to do some of our organizing. None of it really necessarily stays entirely contained to that, but that just kind of gives you a little bit of a sense. I'm not going to go through all of this like whole history, but basically, this area was largely deforested for making potash for selling as potassium fertilizer. We went through a whole variety of things. Vermont was its own country for about 8 years, or no, almost 15 years. And then we became part of the United States. So there was the Vermont Republic at one time. And then we largely shifted into sheep and root crops and maple, but we were actually making more maple sugar than maple syrup at the time because we were trying to compete with the Indies for the sugar market. And then in the 20s, that shifted to dairy farms. And then a social factor came in the 1960s. A lot of folks from the radical left started moving up to Vermont to escape government repression from anti-war organizing and other things. And so you had a confluence of this traditional farming culture and these radicals coming out of urban areas. And so those two, it's a little more complicated than that, but those two pieces are the basic kind of like recipe for what the flavor that you get now. And as Graham said, things have diversified considerably from dairy. This is all very, very just sort of back of the envelope. The 7 towns that I just described, I think it may be more than 10,000 people now, but I think it's about 10,000 people. There's an average median household income of about $35,000 to $45,000 a year. The food security stat, I'm not totally sure how current that is, but at least 10 years ago, it was 1 in 4 kids in our community were experiencing food insecurity. We have a lot of nonprofits and community groups working on these things far beyond this number, but we have 3 organizations holding down a lot of great work here. And then those 7 towns alone yield at least 70 farms by my count. John and his team did great work today trying to come up with some numbers for me, and I added some more in. And so I think we've got probably like 75 plus farms in about 7 towns. And as Graham was saying, while the acreage and the dollars are big in dairy, actually it's incredible how diversified our area and region are. There's over 20 vegetable farms just in those 7 towns. And they range from small, probably not even 1 acre, to 100 acres of and it's largely all certified organic production. We don't have a lot of commercial fruit production here in terms of things like orchards selling wholesale apples. That's mostly closer to Lake Champlain, but we do have a number of orchards where you can pick, and we do have some wholesale growers. And we have a lot of you-pick berries. We have lots of beef production, a pretty second to vegetables, where beef is probably greater than vegetables at this point. Hannah would be the largest chicken producer here, but we also have some smaller chicken operations. We've got a handful of egg producers, something that we could use more of. Tremendous amount of syrup. It would be impossible for me to name a number of farms because everybody kind of does that in their backyard already anyway. You've got some grain production, but very limited. This is not really like grain growing area. Most of that grain production goes as feed, or actually we have a small distillery industry around here, so a certain amount of that. And then there's a handful of other crops: mushrooms, hops, flowers, Christmas trees, fiber, and then processed things like some people making jams, beer, spirits, and baked goods. So a little context here. I'm not going to read all of these principles, but basically as we kind of go through the next stuff, start thinking through the lens of food sovereignty. And, at the end of the day, I think these are all pretty well known to most of us and pretty basic. It looks a lot like what you've already been hearing about. And I think as we all are here, we have a shared understanding that agroecology is a path towards food sovereignty. So while agroecology really doesn't have a centralized idea of exactly what the core principles are, I think, basically there's sort of like 10 to 13 principles that we all generally agree on. And so this is sort of the most spelled out version of that. And these principles have gone a lot have really influenced the way that we've thought about sort of trying to grow and make more dynamic the local food system. So I'm going to switch to where I'm more comfortable with diagrams. So can anybody read this? Okay, just tell me you can. I'll read it anyway, but it'll make me feel better. So this is an attempt to start then saying, okay, if these are the principles, like how do we map this in our community, and how do we start like actually doing the like on the ground nuts and bolts problem solving to like make that real? So if you start trying to map out a food system, an intact food system, fundamentally you've got things like land access and financing, local soil inputs to that land, seeds and plants, tools and equipment, labor, farm production, food processing, storage and distribution, local food access, local food consumption, knowledge creation and dissemination, and food byproduct recycling and reuse. It's basically all the same stuff, but this is more like functional. And so we started. There was a point at which there was a handful of us that were starting to meet as producers in the area, realizing that we kind of had something special in the community in terms of like a pretty well built out system. Like we already had a lot of these components in place. But Molly used a really key phrase before, which was gap filling. And so we started trying to map where the gaps were so that we could identify like, okay, if we start collaborating in this at the next level, where are we filling gaps? So the individual operators are doing certain things, where are the gaps? So initially an organization emerged out of that, which was originally called the Center for Bio-Based Economy and then emerged into the Center for an Agricultural Economy, which John Ramsey is the director of and will be touring you guys on Monday, I think. Something like that? Yeah. And had this map, sort of like had we been looking at this map about 20 years ago, really we had a lot of these components. We didn't have a lot of these components, right? So we had farmers of all sorts. We had seed producers. We had composters. We had these like core producer components. But we didn't necessarily have all these parts that kind of like linked things to that next level. So Freddie this morning was talking about the evolution of going from like individual capacity to collective capacity. This is what we're talking about, right? This is what we start looking at this at a community scale. And Linda Ramsdell was in those early conversations. And so I probably won't sit here and try to read every single one of these small pieces of writing for you. But you can see that it's really heavy on the social organization over here, because a lot of these are functions that are better done at a social scale, not an individual scale. So some of the key things that I'll just mention, we've got a lot of these key things. We have land. We live in a place with an abundance of land, obviously, but the bigger issue is often land access in terms of people being able to afford land. So that's still an ongoing challenge for us. There's still a lot of efforts to try to make land more accessible. You've got soil inputs. We've talked about compost today. There's a biochar producer locally. There's probably about 5 composters in those 7 towns that we just described. We're probably the largest of them, and some of them are quite small. But it goes from everything from dairy farms that are making a little money on the side from their manure to actually a sawmill that's got all this carbon material and has been delivering meat chips, and he was like, hey, you seem to be doing okay with that. Why don't I get in? And now he's making his own compost. So we've got a number of input producers. Coming down to looking for gap fillers here. Years ago, as a bunch of small farmers, at more homestead scale and small commercials farmers, we realized that we often needed tools, specialized tools, like Hannah was talking about, that we weren't big enough to warrant purchasing. And so we banded together and created the North Country Farmers Union, which is now the Small Farmers Guild. And that is a small homestead collective, basically, that shares things like chicken processing equipment, honey processing equipment, fiber processing equipment, and so on and so forth. They also share a grain bin, so they can buy bulk grain, and folks can come with just 5-gallon buckets and fill up grain for their chickens and feed at bulk prices. I mentioned before that we have all these farms here, but there's also other ways that food production happens locally. So one key thing is food production for your own family, right? So gardening and homesteading. This area has an abundance, and I couldn't begin to quantify that for you here. But it's very well articulated. And specifically, one of the projects of the People's Agroecology School of Vermont is the Food Sovereignty Growers Project, which is, Kayla's in here, and Kayla's been our primary intern on that. And it's working with food pantry clients, folks that are food insecure and already receiving food from the charitable food system, to bump up their gardening game and also be able to sell food back into the charitable food system to the food pantry, who will commit to buying it, or to community meals. We're also trying to give a place for retiring growers who are physically not able to do what they're doing to work as local extension agents in that network. Just moving along to some of these other highlights, and then I'll come to the center in a second. We've got quite a few cheesemakers around here. Notably, we have Deep Root Organic Co-op, which is it's bigger than the Hardwick area, but it's based in this area. It's about 13 plus organic vegetable farms in Vermont and several from Quebec that collectively market and sell produce together and truck and warehouse it together. We have an incredible local food consumer co-op in the area that you'll see. Manuel and Mirna have both been involved there over the years. And I think today I mentioned, but we've gone through this really dramatic, exciting change where we're no longer really isolating in organic and local food, but really focusing more on cooperativizing the local economy altogether. We've got Salvation Farms, which is a gleaning organization, so they're going onto farms to gather non-marketable produce and then turn around and get that back out into the food system. And so, for instance, we'll move extra eggs that we can't market through them, or chicken. They do have gleaners that go out and actually harvest beets or whatever else. And so there's a whole variety of other things over here. Oh, and then there's the, well, I won't comment. So the Center for an Agricultural Economy emerged out of the intent to be a gap filler in the places that needs weren't being met already. And so I think, pretty impressed with CAE when you get there, but it's got many programs, and this does not capture all of them. But these are some of the key gap fillings. It runs the Vermont Farm Fund, which gives low interest, very, very accessible loans to farmers, generally $10,000 and less, but up to 30. Is that right, John? Yep. Most of us have taken loans through that, I assume. The Grow Your Own program is like the Food Sovereignty Growers Project, but largely education-based, so monthly workshops on bumping up your gardening game. Everything from seed starting to how to break down a whole chicken and make 3 meals out of 1 bird. CAE runs our local, the Hardwick Farmers Market. There are multiple farmers markets in the area, but that's the one CAE runs. It has Farm Connects, which is, in my mind, very mission critical. Farm Connects is a distribution system. How many trucks now? 5 trucks? Yeah. And how many employees with Farm Connects? Okay, so just this one piece alone, which basically does at-cost trucking, basically. So they come to the farm gate and pick up all of our stuff and then distribute it all around the state for us. They've got 5 trucks and 15 people now doing warehousing and moving and trucking all of that material. I mean, it's got to be millions of dollars. I don't know how many millions of dollars at this point, but this is a key thing, right? When we're talking about organizing and gap filling, trucks are not sexy, but like we can't get trucks to we can't get trucks to certain places, and it's extremely expensive. So these guys come in at about 1/3 of the cost of the commercial trucking options that we have around here. The Vermont Food Venture Center is a place where food processing can happen, and so you can go rent the kitchens by the hour and have storage space. Just Cut is a program of CAE that is a CAE staff, and it's staff doing light processing and chopping carrots and getting them frozen and then selling them to schools in the winter so that we can take local produce and carry it forward into the winter, which is pretty key for us around here. And then coming back to things like food production, having the community gardens and making sure that everybody has access to a garden. So I think there's a tremendous amount more for us to do, and if there were more locals here, I was going to kind of engage everybody in a little bit of an exercise, but I think we can pass around that. The one last thing that I just wanted to say is, with any, and this is a little bit more broad, and of course I'm not sure if you can read that either. But this is other work from Vermont. This is systems theory work that comes out of the late Donella Meadows, who passed away about 10, 15 years ago. And I first heard Donella speak out at the WTO protests in Seattle in the late 90s. And as an organizer, it made a tremendous amount of sense and has informed my own theory of change since then. And I think the key takeaway here is that while policy is really important, this is sort of descending, like this is the most powerful way to intervene and transition a system. This is the least effective way, right? So things like policy, where is policy on here even? Policy is going to show up more in these zones up here, like feedback loops. Like, you can't do this, you can do this. So, Graham was a part of a feedback loop that said, you can't do that with your cows. And you can change these things. But until you actually start affecting the mindset, the paradigm, the values of a culture, these are all secondary, right? And so really, I think this is the zone that we need to be focusing on, and it's kind of the reason why I think actually our community, being as small as it is, has so much capacity, because we have this really strong local culture. And it's not just a local culture of everybody going to the high school basketball games, which they do, but I think while there still is a lot more growth opportunity for us to share our own political articulation and deepen that, there is a tremendous amount of collaboration. It's a very participatory culture here. It's a very mutualist culture here. And I think it's a very you know, with all of these things that keep happening, we keep creating more and more opportunities for shared experience and building trust. And trust is sort of the foundation of anything that we can do, right? Without trust, we can't do anything dramatic. So I don't know if there's any of the locals in here that want to add to this. John, I don't know specifically if you have some thoughts on this, or if anybody wants to say something about what sort of seems like it helps to influence like the capacity to get things done. I mean, shout it out, anybody. Yeah, do it. No, don't put them on the spot. But.
Sorry, John. I was told we had to use the mic.
The willingness to take a little risk.
Anyone else have thoughts that they would like to share? Austin, was that a hand?
We have something in Vermont called Front Porch Forum. What this is unique to Vermont is this listserv called Front Porch Forum that's very localized, where people just, it's a great mutual aid thing. If someone is trying to build something but they don't have money for materials, they'll just say, does anyone have drywall that is sitting around in their basement or something? And people are helping people a lot. And it's really, since we had the 2 floods, there's a different attitude. A lot of people are helping each other more and more. So I think it's a really great new kind of paradigm shift is happening. I've seen it. So.
I'm just struck by what's happening. I mean, I knew sort of about it, but I'm struck by what's happening in the Northeast Kingdom and the different flavor that it has here compared to the Upper Valley where I live, where we're much closer to the seat of power and money. And the mutual aid aspect of it and the really getting at what's needed aspect of it that's happening here is what's missing down there. So.
So I've been in and around the CAE, not really part of it, but one thing that I would add, beside the Food Venture Center, is an incubator for farmers who want to create value-added products, which is a big help if they can get something going. And part of that is, it kind of is, then the farmers markets around become their like test market. And, you know, before they try it out in like, you know, Montpelier Farmers Market, they'll see how it reacts. So it's a really nice little ecosystem of people learning whether they want to do that. And some people have gone on to, you know, be a success with it, and other people have decided it's not their thing. So, and so the CAE, the Food Venture Center, has business advisor support for that. They have equipment. I think one time, you know, they could partner with somebody to get a grant for bottling equipment, you know, that kind of thing. So that's pretty cool.
Anyone else have thoughts or things that we've missed that are coming up? And this is just an opportunity for discussion, so it can be an open space.
Well, I just was reflecting on this, Tom, and I haven't seen this before, but you know, we talk about these places to intervene in a system and like the transcending paradigms place, but also like part of this is the place it takes the most work to reach outside of like a moment, you know, happening in the moment transcendence, you know, is the higher places on that, right? So you can't immediately get to transcendence. So when we talk about those policy shifts or some of the other organizing work we're doing, or even direct action, or those different things that you saw pop up tonight, or even like the niche thing of poultry farmers for compost foraging, or like slaughtering an animal on a farm and having a regulation that allows you to do it. They may seem small in the picture of things, and it may be when you look at something like this, we talk about this as an organization, how do you decide what to work on? In a world where we see horrors unfolding around us and like real needs on farms, from affordability of health insurance to affordability of just the basic, you know, exchange of goods, you know, where can we actually use our power to make a difference? And that's also a part of that question of like intervening to actually have an outcome that meets a community need while also being directed, I think, at that transcending paradigms, you know, end point, that horizon. It's part of what I'm thinking about, what we talked about tonight and looking at this.
I think it's really important to not think like, okay, everything else up here solves itself if we just jump down here and we hang out with people we like, you know? And I think what part of what Graham is articulating is like each of these things, and Peggy sort of said it from a different angle about people at the farmer's market getting to try different things, is, you know, sometimes we get to we toggle back and forth, and so doing policy work allows us to be like clarifying in that process our values along the way, for instance. And so we go back and forth. And I don't think it makes the policy work irrelevant. I think in some ways it makes it more, it helps us articulate it. It's almost like art. It reflects back to us something. But I will tell you a little example pertinent to food systems organizing. Parallel to this, but relevant, is separate from the, so in 2008, we started organizing meaningfully statewide to try to pass the universal recycling law in Vermont, which was what ultimately banned sending food to the landfill. It took us about 4 years to get it through the legislature. And it covers all aspects of recycling. So it's everything from like aluminum and glass and electronics and stuff like that. But the organic materials, the food scraps and stuff like that, that's what I cared about. And so there was a couple of us that drafted, you know, most of that legislative language. And so while there was a whole movement around getting the work done, the actual development of the policy and the language was happening in a small group. And we slipped in something that I'm personally really proud of because it actually starts capturing some of these parts down here, which is called the organics management hierarchy. And so what we were afraid of is exactly what has begun to happen here and in other places, that when we passed a ban, that corporations would end run us and that we would be just sending resources right into their hands and not actually being able to make use of them ourselves. And so we said, you know, the problem here, as we all know, is a market-based system. It's a capitalist system. That's what's going to undermine this whole thing. And so we built in this hierarchy that said, above and beyond any market conditions, here's what you have to do with your food. And so the first thing in Vermont is if you're a business and you have food that you can't sell or whatever, the first question you have to ask yourself is it edible? If it's edible, it must go to the food pantry or to a food bank. It must go back into the community. The second one is if it's not edible, can it be fed to livestock? And that's where the compost foraging part starts. And then the next one is composting, and then methane production, and then energy recovery. And there's an actual hierarchy. And compared to the EPA hierarchy or any of the hierarchies you see in other states, this was a mandate. It said you have to do this. It doesn't matter who's willing to pay you this much to make power out of what you want. You have to send it into the charitable food system. Because at the end of the day, Americans are addicted to electricity, and so energy producers will always be able to pay higher dollar than food insecure families, right? That's kind of basic math. And so we didn't want that happening. So we wrote this, but we were afraid it was like too socialist to like really lay out there, and so we kind of like did the slow roll and like slid it in there without bringing attention to it, and we didn't organize around that part. And it passed, and we were like, yes. And I haven't personally seen a social contract like that in other policy that I've seen and worked on, and it felt really gratifying. Fast forward 6 years, and a Maine methane company came into Vermont, worked with our governor to, like outside of the legislative process, bend the rules and reinterpret some language and allow in this technology, this depackaging technology that I was referencing. So it was very clear that they were breaking the rules and that this was very anti-democratic. So with Rural Vermont and the Conservation Law Foundation and VPIRG and a bunch of conservation groups, we went and tackled this, and we went into the legislature. We fought it for a couple years. But the really painful part was that the hierarchy did not have like social commitment. You know, like I was expecting like this to happen and people were gonna be like rioting in the streets, you know, but nobody fucking knew about it. And nobody, like we hadn't done organizing work. We had done only policy work on that one. And then it bit us in the butt because like nobody cared because they didn't even know it was there. So, you know, I think it's just that like that whole balance of going back and forth. Because unless we all agree on what the values are, then the values don't exist, you know?
I was just going to appreciate the idea of rural Vermont listening early on to farmers and hearing about healthcare and housing and like issues that you wouldn't think are agricultural issues, and just, I guess, championing the idea of mutual aid efforts more broadly as part of the Hardwick area food system, maybe somehow.
Yeah, could you actually just say something quickly about that?
I just did. I don't know. No, probably not. What do you want me to say? And also housing, right? Like housing is crucial. Farm worker housing is a big issue here, and housing in general. And so Linda is the president of Headwaters Community Trust, housing community trust, land trust, trying to develop perpetually affordable houses where the easement is on affordability. So regardless of how many times it's sold, it's still an affordable house. And then, yeah, mutual aid groups really sprung into action in the floods of 2023 and 2024. And yeah, I think it's a vital part of the community. And like, I really feel like it's kind of embedded in the Vermont culture too. Everybody goes off the road in the ice or in the snow, or everybody gets stuck, and it's like, it's just so common to get pulled out by your neighbor or someone you have no known relation to. So yeah, it's a nice part of this culture, I think.
So we can kind of like also just open it up a little bit because we're wrapping up. So if there's like questions for Hannah or Diane, or I'm standing here, but or Molly, like or back to the rural Vermont stuff, like we don't have to stay totally to the Hardwick food system.
I'm going to try and squeeze this question out of me. My introduction to Hardwick as a person who's been in Vermont only a year has been the floods and kind of witnessing it from afar. And I also saw through conversations, I work a lot in water, and I saw through conversations how FEMA buyouts were being stopped by local government in order to maintain property taxes within the state and for school systems, and it's a very complex challenge. And yeah, I'm kind of curious how some of these principles and this work is applying to like long-term planning for Hardwick. As met a farmer the other day at a UVM extension event that moved out of Hardwick because repeated flooding on their land. And I guess, how are you all having conversations around some of this like longer term, really sticky, like convoluted issues with just the landscape changing with climate change?
Well, a couple of different ways. So really, locally, as an example, the Granite Street neighborhood in Hardwick was really impacted by the flooding in 23 and 24. And the Center for Ag Economy, we own 15 acres adjacent to that neighborhood. So we're actually in a planning process right now with the town of Hardwick to evaluate not only how can we continue to grow food at Atkins Field, but how can that place actually serve and reduce the impact of flooding in that neighborhood. So we're, hiring engineers and, looking at different ways in which that property could actually be, potentially, modified in some ways so that it's more of a catch basin to reduce flooding in that area. On a more statewide level, Center for Ag Economy, NOFA, many organizations have been supporting farms directly after flooding, and we built a coalition, went to the legislature this year, and proposed essentially a farm recovery fund that the state would actually appropriate funds and essentially hold them for climate disasters, so that there are funds immediately available at a scale that meets the need and can be dispersed very quickly, versus relying on small nonprofits to be the folks on the ground immediately in the aftermath of a really tragic event like that. So those are some of the like very local in Hardwick and the very statewide that we're working on right now.
I would love to hear from anyone who's involved with like rural Vermont organizing, just like specifically around how y'all navigate like struggles and specifically like issues and struggles related to farm workers and like farm worker organizing in the state and even like locally, hyper locally, in the state in general. I asked that specifically in the context of like I know that like in New York, with the sort of like newer wave of farm worker organizing that has happened with the legalization of collective bargaining in New York State, some of the sharpest opposition to that and organizing against that has been from small grower associations and like organizations. Yeah, and also in the context where I am in Massachusetts, one of the farms that I work at is sort of seen in the climate resilience and small farm like ecosystem, seen as like this like darling farm, like an example of like a really a farm that's doing like really solid agricultural practices at scale and part of this like local whatever economy and economy like agronomic economy, and is like also to farm workers in the area like famously exploitative and has been like pretty sharply opposed to and antagonistic to attempts to organize workers, and the workers like trying to even just advocate for basic things like healthcare and benefits and like just like raises that like go up each year according to inflation. And so just like it just I don't know, I just see some of the antagonisms there between sort of like small growers and farm workers, and I'm just curious to hear how, if that's the thing that comes up, or like how rural Vermont has navigated that, and just in general farm worker specific issues and struggles, and what is the relationship there.
Thank you, Ellen. I think that's an important question, and it gets at one of the biggest issues for the farmer and farm worker community, which is lack of parity, right? So like folks are so marginal. There's just like the profits are so slim, and what the situation we end up getting into is a bottleneck where we're trying to squeeze even more from the folks who don't have it to begin with. And that doesn't make like these exploitations okay at all, but it does encourage us to back up a little bit and look at organizations. We're so lucky to have migrant justice in this state, and I hope I don't get it wrong, but I believe it's consumer-driven social responsibility is the program that they have implemented with Milk with Dignity, and it recognizes that we need these investments into our labor chain to provide basic dignity for farm workers. And we know, so that this is particularly related to dairy farmers, and which we know are losing money every single day. And so you can't squeeze blood from a stone. But you know who is making money in the lineup is the CEOs of the corporations that are actually profiting off of the backs of both the farmers and the farm workers. And so rather than dividing ourselves and creating more division, we need to like zoom out and get underneath and actually look at what are the systemic problems that make this a really untenable situation for everyone. And it's not an answer, but I think I would encourage unity rather than pitting one against the other. But it does come down to ownership and land ownership and the whole ball of wax that brings up, and it's a really important one. And from a rural Vermont perspective, we look to the leadership of migrant justice. We see our role as really amplifying and supporting their work, but they are the organization that is directly in community and in contact with the farm worker community. They're the ones who have language access. They're the ones who are visiting those farms regularly, and it's recognizing that like that community is incredibly well organized, and they know exactly what they want, and they have a roadmap that's really well thought out of how to get there. And Hannaford, you need to join the Milk with Dignity program.
Everything Molly just said, I fully agree with, and then I would just say, you know, we also, adding to that, like we have a lot of non-migrant labor, so migrant justice really organizes the migrant farm worker community, but we have a lot of non-migrant farm workers in Vermont as well. And there isn't any real like organizing hub for that right now. There has been recently some efforts by some workers at some food processors in the area to go through the Vermont Workers Center to do some organizing. Vermont's gonna be a hard place to get some of those things passed because that sort of like that rural small farm mentality sort of we tend to not want to have a lot of constraints about how we operate things, and if you don't like it here, go work somewhere else kind of type thing. I'm not validating that idea, but that's sort of the attitude. Fundamentally, personally, what I would really like to see us do is form a farmers and farm workers union. You know, that is food producers at large union, so that because the problem is like, we pay the best wages that we can pay, and then we pay in kindness beyond that, but it's still not enough, right? And so, but if I'm going to sell all my eggs in the community, like I got to keep prices in parity with like local incomes. So there's this triangle. It's a triple bind, and we can't. I think, like Molly was saying, we can't solve it by being in opposition. It's got to be a collaborative outcome. And I would love for a farmers and farmers union in this community to be in contract with the community at large, and have agreements about wages and prices and finding parity between those things.
My question is about the floods. So I talked to an Abenaki elder, Earl Hetley. I'm sure a lot of you probably know him. So he was saying that because he's working on his Seven Sisters garden, which is a very interesting technique. But he was saying that to build the resilience against the floods, he works with the beavers. So beavers, they build the dams and then they stop the water and things. So are there like any such practices which are being like sort of incorporated by rural Vermont, or like are they prevalent or? Yeah, so to build the resilience again, because like floods is like now a very normal thing in Vermont in that context. So.
No, thanks for the, I don't know if this is on, but thanks for the question. And yeah, if you all were here last year or the year before, you'd be seeing a different landscape, especially driving up if you drove up Route 2 in the Winooski River Valley or in certain other places. I think my most baseline answer to that is that amongst the things we do, one of the things one of the positions we don't fulfill as much is like technical service providers in terms of like helping people implement practices on farms, and we have a lot of amazing institutions and service providers in the state through the extension networks or through the farm viability networks or through a lot of these great services that exist. So, when John spoke before about this policy work related to flood resiliency and emergency funding relief, like that was a place we really kicked in. Or when there's debates about like some of the cost benefits. Like, for example, when we passed, a law was passed 2 years ago, which is going to limit the use of neonicotinoid pesticides, similar to in Ontario and Quebec in the European Union. But there was a debate sort of going on in parts of the farming community and in the legislature saying, you've asked some of these larger commodity crop farmers to farm in different ways, right? With more no-till techniques to support, resilience in drought conditions, to support soil health, but those techniques are also dependent upon particular herbicides and pesticides, and when you create certain conditions in the soil with more organic matter, are you going to draw the same pests that the neonics? So there are debates around like methodologies within some of these larger conversations, but I would say for the most part, outside of like advocating for more progressive responses from agroforestry to the floodplain support. One thing we've been talking about actually is thinking about, historically, Tom talked about the history of Vermont, and a lot of the agriculture of Vermont is in floodplains. So there's a question to some extent of, how do we think about land planning as a whole state going forward and as communities? So that's a little outside of like the actual on-farm practices, like you may have been talking with Earl about or others, and it's more about how do we think about larger scale, like where do people live, where do people farm, where do people produce forest products, et cetera, et cetera. And that's still a very, I'm not sure it's a nascent conversation, but it's a complicated one because you have a lot of competing processes and visions from something called 30 by 30 or 50 by 50, which some of you may have heard about at the international level, which we would call sort of affiliated with like sort of the false solutions to climate change, a market-driven model. Or, other visions we're talking about, like the New England Feeding New England vision, which is like, how do we feed the people in this region? What would that take? And all the questions that come complicated with that. And I think ideally, at least from like the place where we sit, we'd be looking at more of a holistic democratic process. We're talking about how do we use this land for all these purposes, what's the most appropriate land, what communities need, and not just focusing on preserving 50% of the land for fortress conservation or doing X, Y, or Z. So that's one way I'd answer that question, but I'm happy for other people to want to chime in on that too.
Hey, I'm Dee Dee Persaus. I'm Henry Nichols' mom. And so there's some interesting history here around flood resilience in Vermont, that rural Vermont was and Vermont Healthy Soils Coalition, which I'm part of, were very tied together with, that there was a group of watershed farming groups. And also, I just want to mention, we have an alternative form of government in the United States called the conservation districts that are a watershed. They're based on watersheds, and we have elected supervisors of those districts that anybody can run for. That's very unknown, but it is literally another form of governance related to watersheds and organized by watershed. So there is a group. There was a Farmer Watershed Alliance group that went to the state and proposed that farmers who know how to manage land in order to create what I call a deep soil sponge, or what these farmer watershed groups call a deep topsoil future that soaks up rain in place where it falls in the soil structure, that those farmers be paid by local communities or by the state or by the watershed to prevent flooding. And they went to the state, and the state said, okay, we'll create a pilot project. And they set up a state working group that rural Vermont had a seat on, and we had a seat on, to develop a pilot project. And that got very quickly co-opted by groups who saw Vermont's interest in this as a way as sort of a test case for a new asset class on Wall Street called natural asset companies. And so those companies started kind of steering the conversation. And for example, we were given 1 hour to come up with a definition of a way of measuring soil health, and 1 hour to come up with a price for soil health that would fly on Wall Street. And some of us, Caroline Gordon and Graham, were there from rural Vermont a lot, and Molly, you were there. And so there was a group of us that started saying, hey, this is not what this group was supposed to be doing, and this is not what we want to do. And we were able to steer the process away from that, but we were never able to fully fulfill the original intention of it. However, those farmer watershed groups, a small group of them, has been developing and designing processes that do this, that help figure out how to farm in ways without using a lot of herbicides, how to farm in ways that do create that soil sponge or that deep topsoil future in these kinds of soils and these conditions. And it is a growing movement. So thanks.
We can be done. I just wanted to thank you all for having us so much. It's really incredible to be somewhere and see organizations with such like a radical vision, like such a practical vision, and a vision that really serves people where they're at and brings them in. Sometimes it feels like those things are in conflict, like meeting people's immediate needs and having this like transformative view. And like I think you're really teaching me personally that like they're not, right? So I appreciate you for that. And sorry, I'm in the NFU in Canada, so this is a nerdy question. But can you say a little bit more about having like a horizontal leadership structure in rural Vermont? Can you say that last part? Oh, like having a horizontal leadership structure, or like what that looks like.
I'm closer, so I'll go, and then I promise we'll cut you all loose because I know we're over time. But having a horizontal leadership structure, it's shared power, right? It's shared agency. And so rural Vermont is a tool for our membership to help direct and strategize as deemed most useful and effective. And what the transition looked like for us is we moved away from having an executive director, which for a tiny little nonprofit like rural Vermont was a position that was inherently unsustainable. People were working 80 plus hours a week, asked to do so much more than was realistic, and it just created burnout. And it's really difficult for an organization to continue when there's an unsustainable environment for staff. And it's also like a direct conflict for an organization that works for social and economic justice to be exploiting its staff, not on purpose, but that was just like inherently how it was happening. And so when we transition to, we call it sociocracy, which is kind of a funny word for saying shared leadership, and it gives staff different levels of agency within a very clearly defined zone. And so we define like what those domains are and like what is the area that one is able to make decisions and act quickly and move at the direction of our membership, and where do we need to be like, hey, we've got questions, we need support, and we have to go back to our grassroots community, to our board. We need more strategizing to know what is going to be the will of our people. Yeah, so it's allowed us to be a lot more nimble and get a lot more done. And as Graham said, it's also allowed folks to really lean into what their skills are and to further define those skills with the support of the grassroots community. I don't know if that really answered it. We should probably wrap up. Would anyone like to provide closing words? I feel like I've talked a lot. Tom, I was looking at you, or Graham, but if I must. We just appreciate y'all coming out so much, and just deep, eternal gratitude for all of the farmers. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, John. I know I'm missing people. This community is incredible. You want to say something? And thank you, Ed, and the United Church of Christ of Greensboro for hosting us here tonight, and for the many farms that we're partnering with over the next, I think, 5 days of the short course in People's Agroecology. We'll be visiting folks throughout the kingdom and central Vermont. We would love to hear from you and have you get involved. So if you are not already part of our crew and you want to learn more, please come talk to us and hang out after and get to know what we're about, and maybe we'll come to your farm in the future. Thank you all.